A new article out today predicts that the war in Ukraine will end in a stalemate. It goes on to say that Russia has so far shown no desire to conquer all of Ukraine's territory, despite Western media narratives to the contrary. It also states that the expectations of Washington and Kiev are unrealistic, and that Zelensky has painted himself into a corner uh, in a way that um, he cannot possibly hope to achieve all of his objectives, and also politically he cannot afford to uh, fail in those objectives. And so here we are. This war, I think, can rapidly come to a close if Russia's demands are met. And some of those demands would be the total recognition of all of Russia's newly acquired territories, which Washington refuses to accept, and hence the war continues. Um, Also, for any weapons that have been sent to Ukraine by NATO countries, um, the range of those weapons has to be. So, for instance, if a weapon can fire 150 kilometers away, then that's how far at least the weapon has to be stationed permanently in Ukraine, thus protecting the territories that Russia has acquired. And so Russia will fight to not only preserve the new borders, but also to safeguard them in the future from possible attacks, and I would say likely attacks from the Ukrainian side. And if those conditions were met, then not only could the war end rapidly, but also um, it would only reignite if those conditions were violated in the future. And so it would not be it would be more in line with the Korean ceasefire than it would be a permanent peace treaty, because I don't know that Ukraine wants to accept those conditions, even though they clearly know what those conditions are, which means they're willing to send their men to die for futile objectives or futile hopes of achieving all of their objectives, and will continue to pour men into the fight, to send men to their deaths needlessly, in the hopes of achieving all of those objectives. And how many men it would take in order to accomplish that theoretically, to me, that is an unacceptable burden on Ukraine for its future. Its leadership does not feel this way, and perhaps they think that the goals can be met with much less bloodshed. But I don't think that's realistic based on the facts on the ground. And so, it is my position that what would be required for them to drive out Russian forces would be horrendous, even more horrendous than what has already happened. But then also, in the end, it would likely be met with a nuclear response from Russia, or some kind of response that has not yet been seen on the ground, which is a very scary proposition. And ultimately, that could escalate to a third world war, which nobody should want. And it would simply increase and magnify the suffering of the world, uh, even outside Ukraine's borders. Another thing to remember is that whatever the outcome, Russia has laid a condition for the end of the conflict with Ukraine not being admitted to NATO, and yet recently at Vilnius, Lithuania, the NATO member states have suggested, or really stated their goal and re-acknowledged their goal is to eventually admit Ukraine into NATO. And so, with such an unacceptable objective from the Russian perspective, this war would necessarily continue into perpetuity, and thus that would permanently destabilize Eastern Europe. And I don't think that's something people have really considered as a likely outcome for such statements. And it is possible the longer this war goes on and the more governments in the West collapse or change hands into new parties and new leadership, that they will rescind those objectives and be willing to accept a neutral Ukraine, which was really Russia's goal. Not necessarily to control Ukraine's destiny, but to prevent Ukraine's destiny from endangering Russia or its or ethnic Russians outside of Russia, namely in eastern Ukraine, and also to damage Russian interests in the Black Sea region and anywhere else that might be affected by Ukraine's increased military capacity, especially given they've shown deadly intent in the last over the last decade toward Russia and Russians. So those are not impossible things for Ukraine to accept. They stubbornly cling to their stated objectives at the expense of many lost lives and Ukraine's future. Even recently, there was a report that the minefields would take over 700 years to clear in eastern Ukraine, which is just a crazy idea. I think that's an exaggeration, but still, it would take decades to reach a point where, I mean, I don't know about absolute certainty, but to reach a point where Ukrainian grounds were considered at least almost all safe to inhabit, and for children to play in. And so this is where the world will not tolerate a forever war. Something will happen. Something will pop off, and the question is, will it escalate to a wider war? Which is something all the sides said they wanted to avoid in the beginning, or from the beginning. And so I don't think that, even from, if you consider the Ukrainian perspective, which is not one I generally share, but and sometimes even vehemently oppose, but especially when it's met with or carried out by evil actions against civilians or prisoners of war, etc., or journalists, yeah, people who otherwise pose little or no threat to Ukraine, who are obliterated or tortured or mistreated in some way. But if you look at it from a Ukrainian perspective, what can Kiev hope to gain by losing so much bloodshed in order to recapture those territories that for the most part, or a majority of the people living there, do not want to be ruled by Kiev? It means they would be back into let's say, you can't really say that they would be back in a 2021 position, because now that so much more bloodshed has happened as a result of this conflict escalation, it wouldn't exactly be how it was pre-2022. But still, I think that they would be met with resistance on the ground, just as Russia has encountered resistance from Ukrainian civilians. The government of Kiev would encounter resistance from the people left who survived the war, even if hypothetically they were able to recapture all the lost territories, especially in places like Crimea and some places in the Donbass region. many people would not want to be ruled by Kiev, and would it would just be, it's not that it would be impossible to rule people who do not want to be ruled by you. Obviously, that has happened many times in history. It's that, is it worth sacrificing all of these lives in order to reach such a political reality? Um, if that was the best they could hope for, why sacrifice so much blood to acquire that goal? Um, and you have to wonder if merely the will to keep fighting is because, again, Zelensky has set these goals that now he can't back away from, which was a political miscalculation. Um, and then also maybe there's reasons of corruption or greed, that propel these people to contradict logic, um, in order to, prosecute the war, to keep it going. Um, yeah, I don't think that's rational though. Again, the cost would eventually outweigh any kind of benefit, in my judgment. And that's if I'm being sympathetic to the Ukrainian side. Uh, and most notably, if I were to be sympathetic to that side, one one would have to think about the amount of men, women, and children that would be lost in accomplishing those goals. And that's if Russia didn't decide to, you know, nuke or escalate after having lost the conflict and left humiliated, uh, having sacrificed so much Russian blood along the way. It, I just don't think they're understanding what they're not thinking about the big picture here. Um, and Russia has really thought about the future from the beginning. All of Russian intervention has been a calculation that the future is worth the sacrifice, and that the goals are not impossible for Russia to achieve in the same way that they are highly improbable for Ukraine to achieve their objectives. It is not highly improbable that Russia should succeed. It is not, you know, it is not a given. I would say it's not automatic that Russia will win. Uh, in order for their side to win, they have to keep fighting, and that's not without risk, no matter how powerful you are. And given the most recent ranking as the second most powerful military force on Earth, Russia does have a decided advantage, but that's not, again, war's not automatic. Does America win all of their wars? Clearly not. So Russia cannot simply say that this is a an outcome that's already guaranteed. Um, again, how stable this situation can be, relatively speaking, without escalating even further, it depends on, will Ukraine continue to resort to small illegal tactics in order to try to tilt the balance in their favor, which is again not logical. There's not a lot of logic coming out of Kiev, and that's been one of my primary criticisms from the beginning. The way that these people in Kiev, these leaders in Kiev think, is not. It doesn't pass the smell test. Um, will these underhanded tactics work though, or create such a burden on Russia, like a myriad of insect bites that become so overwhelming, like maybe an attack by ants, that they have to, you know, eventually just simply retreat, because the 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 inconveniences and the losses are significant enough to become an immediate threat to their existence, or um, make any kind of accomplishment of their goals totally impractical. But again, Russia is dug in, and there are interesting and I would argue legitimate reasons why they've dug themselves. And the question is not whether they would um, give up these defensive positions and retreat um, for sort of any reason, but I guess because of the nature of the arguments for being there and continuing to be there and continuing to intervene in this conflict in Ukraine, uh, I think Russia has never lost its arguments, and the events that have unfolded since February of 2022 have only served to confirm Russia's suspicions about what they needed to do um, in Ukraine to preserve the future of their own state and their state's national interests and the lives of the ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Um, yeah, have there been exaggerations? Maybe, is Ukraine filled with Nazis? No, I wouldn't say so. I think they're filled with a lot of. Uh, there are many, many people in Ukraine who resent uh, the Russian presence there, understandably so. Uh, has that increased since the war escalated? Yes. Um, but was it a problem before Russia intervened? Yes, it was. Um, Namely in the east, where there were documented attacks on civilians and just people and even militia members. And the fact that they had reached an agreement through the Minsk Accords to reconcile the differences and grant some level of autonomy while retaining Donbass as part of Ukraine and allowing Crimea to remain outside of Ukraine, that was a good outcome for Ukraine. It was a compromise. Let's be honest. It did involve losing something, namely Crimea, um, but it was not an impossible thing to accept. Except that Kiev is very has the leaders in Kiev have shown a level of stubbornness um, that I find again, and I'll just keep repeating this. It defies logic. It defines clear. So, like, when I think about this, it's just very easy the line between heroism and recklessness is can be thin, and I've thought for a long time now that Ukraine has passed into reckless stubbornness, and and really, when you think about what is heroic, we often think, oh, fighting to the last man and never accepting defeat. Um, Even if you were to think of that as heroic, you have to put yourself in the in the minds of a nation's leader and say, is it best for the people? Recently, in an example of this, supporting my argument, South Africa's president recently refused to cave to any demands for the arrest of Vladimir Putin if he were to uh, show up for the BRICS conference in South Africa. And he said, well, if he does come, which Russia said, okay, he's not going to come, but he'll participate um, via video chat or whatever, video conference. Okay, well, but the South African president said, hey, um, I'm not going to enforce this arrest warrant for Putin because it would necessarily put my country in a direct state of war with the Russian Federation. And so, and his argument was like, look, that contradicts my duty to protect my own people. And so, what if he had said the alternative? So, well, if Putin shows up, I'm just going to arrest him, and that's going to be that, because, well, we're part of the International Criminal Court, and so, well, to be part of them, we're going to have to do what they say. Well, if they had taken that posture, even especially knowing what the likely outcome would be, his argument, Ramaphosa's argument, was that that would endanger the lives of his people. And so, as a leader, he said, "No, this is not something that I can allow." Um, but again, what if he had said, "Well, you know, the again," and I think this is what I was trying to articulate. What if he had said, um, "I'm going to do it, come hell or high water, and we're prepared for whatever Russia's response." Okay, well that sounds defiant. It's kind of like an American way of thinking, like, oh, that increases his credentials, his street cred, and so that, like, a defiant, courageous move. Well, again, if you're being rational, what you have to say is, at what cost um, can we tolerate such statements and such postures? Um, he saw that as against his constitutional duty to protect his people. And so, even if he said, I'm sorry, I'm not I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head here, but again, if you take a posture that shows defiance, it may look like you're brave, but when it costs the lives of the people that you care about or sworn to protect, then it becomes recklessness, because you're not merely taught to think what you would do in a situation, but rather how the effect of what this would bring upon the people that you are responsible for. It's not merely a test of ego. I feel like you have to leave your ego at the door as a leader, or the more you do, the better you become, because you can be divorced from what is basically a distraction. Um, you don't want to be distracted by the impulse to be the dominant or be the alpha, leader. You don't want to be distracted by some impulse of what would be self-gratifying. It does nothing for the people of South Africa to declare war on Russia. It really does nothing. It would ruin their economic relationship with Russia. It would endanger the lives of the people there. They would likely lose a conflict like that. Um, yeah, I'm not saying he was ever really thinking about arresting Putin, but I'm using that as an example of what clear thinking would look like in terms of international relations. And that's the kind of thinking Ukraine seems to lack in Kiev. I mean, these people are so dug in that they can't think about what is the rational response amid this intensity of conflict. How do we get out of this? In what way? But they think so much about saving face and being that kind of alpha, heroic, to the last man um, mentality, and that's, it's not good, because look how much blood has to be thrown away senselessly to bring that about, and that's only if they were successful. Imagine throwing more and more and more blood away and still losing, because that's the risk they're taking, and it's the likely outcome. Russia was always likely to win this. Now, the article in USA Today suggests that Russia and Ukraine will end in a stalemate, but that stalemate, or what might be called a stalemate, would still be the retention of those new territories on the part of Russia, and so that is decidedly a victory for Russia. So I would predict. I mean, I'm not. I try to steer. I try to think about this, the events as they unfold, and to analyze the conflict objectively, and try to consider all of the points of view. And when you make a prediction, it's hard to kind of be 100% right because so many things change on a daily basis in a conflict, and and that's happened in this conflict, and so I don't know what the outcome will be. However, if I had to guess, or at least venture a guess, I would lean towards Russia achieving the retention of the newly acquired territories. But I don't know that it's going to be at a point of security or a point that Ukraine will agree. I can't know that because the events have shown, the thinking in Kiev has shown me that as long as the government in Kiev exists, they will continue to deploy underhanded tactics of terrorism, and and that they either won't sign any agreement that Russia would accept, or even if they did, they would simply ignite the conflict later and go back on their word. I don't think that I mean this Russia's intervention was partially because Kiev went back on its word. Now, was that the understanding of the Russian leadership before they launched the intervention? I don't know that. But I should say the events that have happened since the conflict erupted last year on a wider level, that the events that have unfolded have proven that way of thinking to be true. So whether Russia knew this before they intervened, or whether it's simply the events unfolded in such a way as to prove their suspicions, I can't say. But the point is, Ukraine did go back on their word when because Poroshenko and Merkel and Hollande have all acknowledged that the Minsk agreements were a ruse, and that this lie bought time for Ukraine to expand its military capability to defend any potential Russian intervention. So here we are, and again, the whole point of maybe the point of starting this video was to talk about the new article about predicting the outcome of the war, but or the special military operation, as Russia refers to it. But I guess I don't know if there's sort of a way to sort of summarize everything I've said here. I think it's important maybe just to listen point by point because I have said a lot here. And again, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I think maybe one of the reasons I wanted to speak about this was that I do agree with that prediction to an extent, to the extent I can, considering the unpredictability of the statements of Kiev's leaders, and the actions or the events that have unfolded on the ground. So, if you like as a caveat, if you add those in as factors, then I would say it leans toward the prediction becoming true. And in that case, Russia would, if it did be the outcome finally, then there would be a parade in Moscow, and in a sense that Russia did achieve military its objectives that it would rather have achieved diplomatically. And I think maybe the spirits of the people who have died in this conflict would probably unanimously say they wish that this had been decided on a diplomatic level. And the longer this goes on, the more people on both sides, and really any country's people that get involved, the more people die. And that's something I've not wanted to see. And I think I lament this. Every day you read Russian or Ukrainian or other countries' losses of people who, signed up to go and in many cases support Ukraine, under the radar. This is a tragedy, and every day this conflict lasts, um, there's more and more bloodshed, and again, I'm sounding like a broken record, but that's really what this comes down to. My argument is based on bloodshed. Do you do you accept people needlessly dying, or what you consider needless? And I just think that if something can be achieved diplomatically, then why resort to violence? And if it can't be achieved diplomatically, then we have to ask why that is the case. And clearly, from a logical perspective, as I've laid out, um, I think it was possible for Ukraine, and it still is possible for Ukraine to come to an acceptance of Russia's terms, because the terms that even Russia lays out now, again, if Ukraine gave Russia everything it wanted and got nothing in return, just hypothetically, so the weapons are moved 150, 200 kilometers back from the front line on Ukraine's side. The newly acquired territories by Russia are accepted, and Crimea is permanently lost. Well, that still leaves 2/3 or 3/4 of the country of Ukraine intact, with access to the Black Sea, and potentially to be stocked up with weapons in the long term, as countries, regardless of the NATO commitment, where countries have guaranteed Kiev, and their government uh, stays intact. Um, as far as stability, now again, Kiev's government came to power through illegal means, but now that they're here, I mean, stability is one of the basics of prosperity, one of the foundations of prosperity, and so the more stable Ukraine is, the better off its future. And so, and again, even if they were to, like I said, if they were to able to achieve their objectives in eastern and southern Ukraine, in those former territories of Ukraine, if they were to recapture them, then at what cost, and what would it look like even if they did? And again, that's assuming Russia didn't resort to some kind of nuclear retaliation for losing, which is some risk, which they don't want to do. But considering Russia thinks of this war as existential to their both to their survival potentially, but also to their national interests and to the lives of the ethnic Russians who live in eastern and southern Ukraine. Um, well, what would Russia do? Would they use nukes on people who've lost a war but are still connected to Russia? I think that's unlikely. Um, Even if it would save them from an enemy force, it would still be a nuclear weapon with widespread destruction. And plus, with easterly blowing winds, it would blow some of the radiation towards Russia. I don't think that's likely. Um, it may be done out of spite, I guess, but I don't think that's likely. Um, but there are other ways to escalate this war, even on a conventional level. Russia might consider, if it was sort of do or die, like they're about to lose. So but again, barring that, let's say that's not even part of the outcome, and that they simply lose and leave. Well, again, what would Ukraine be left with to govern in eastern and southern Ukraine after such an outcome? And I'll repeat what I said. What would it cost to get to that point? I just think that we're getting in the point of being totally irrational, and and that's and I'm going to say this again. Kiev has shown irrational thinking, and maybe if I summarize just the Ukrainian position, it goes from on one hand being heroic to the other hand being totally reckless, and I hate to see that, and that's why I'm moved to speak about this so often, because not just that the conflict erupted, but that the nature of the present state of diplomatic affairs in the world on the international relations level is just so low, and it's growing in some regions, in Eurasia and Africa and South, but this Western propensity to solve things militarily because their diplomatic efforts are unreasonable and fail. I just we got to change the way we think about things and about what we want to see in the world. The West needs to do a better job of envisioning a future where uh, Russia and China have their rightful place, and that all the powers of the world have a way of cooperating. We got to get away from this conflictual uh, international relationship between countries and blocks. Um, this whole block confrontation thing, it's got to be gone. It's a Cold War way of thinking that the West has simply not let go of, because in the past 2 or 3 decades since the Cold War officially ended, the West has been less challenged than ever. Really, in the last certain countries in the West have gone unchallenged for a long time now, and they're rather used to the hegemonic position that they don't want to relinquish, and and the events that you see around the world happening are a reflection of that. So, um, yeah, let's see that come to an end, and the world will be better for it. And we talk about a durable peace. That's one of the criterion a criteria for it to happen. Um, anyway, I'm going to ramble on if I keep going. So I hope that any of you have made it this far. Thank you, and I hope that you like and subscribe my channel. And a lot of my videos will be in this similar vein of thinking, but I may expand on it and then also talk about things that current affairs and events that unfold that are new and need their own and deserve their own examination. Because it's one thing to have a narrative in your thinking, but also when you have new facts in the world that need to be parsed through, I'd like to be part of that conversation. So if you like what I'm saying, please like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications, because I do intend on releasing more content, and I hope that it's beneficial to all of you. And I thank you so much for the support you've shown so far. I know I'm just new to this process. Hopefully I can make better content going forward, whether it's in terms of shorts or maybe just shorter videos. Sometimes it's just really hard to get my thoughts all out so quickly, but there is a lot to digest with what I've said, so it was worth taking the time, at least for me to think about it, and I hope for you to listen to it. So thank you very much. I mean that sincerely, and yeah. And also I will release other content on other topics too, not just the war in Ukraine, not just international relations. I'm not only of one mind. That's something that's really big on my mind, but it's not all of my attention. And so don't think that you have to be interested in this exclusively. Like that, I will hopefully make other interesting content too. So thanks, and have a great day. And yeah, thanks.